I'm Director of Metadata Strategies here at the River Campus Library. My sort of elevator pitch for metadata strategies is we make things findable. So as I hope you'll discover as we go through the presentation today, metadata is something that can really, just help you understand, make findable, manage whatever stuff it is you have. I'm going to start a PowerPoint in a moment. That means that I will not be able to see the chat because I'm here on a laptop. So if you have any questions as we go, if you could throw them into the chat. And then Sarah, if it seems like something germane to the moment, please feel free to unmute and interrupt me. Totally cool at that. But let's get started. All right, can you all see my slides?
Yes, we can.
Excellent, just gonna move that down. All right, so just going to get this started. So my presentation, the workshop today is Metadata, a love letter to the future. And as I said, I hope we'll kind of understand that metadata is foundational to your work and also to sharing your work and ensuring its, perpetuity, if you will, into the future. So I always like to start off with kind of a sense of where it is that we're going today. So this is a bit of an overview of what I hope we'll be discussing. We're going to start off with what is metadata. Then once we've defined it, we're going to talk about what we can do with metadata. Again, I manage a department where we do things with metadata, so I tend to take a very functional and practical perspective and view of this subject. We're going to talk about how we create metadata. So for those of you who have seen the phrase metadata schema and looked on in either horror or fear, we're going to dig into that a little bit. We'll talk about how we can share metadata, because really the point, at least to me, one of the most exciting and powerful things about metadata is that it is shareable, and it can help you, sharing not just the metadata, but whatever it is that you're using that metadata to describe. And then finally, we're going to talk about why metadata matters. So let's start off with definitions. What is metadata? Maybe this is an image that pops into your head when you hear that phrase. Maybe you remember 1,000 years ago when we were talking about, the NSA collecting metadata, things like that. The classic definition about metadata is this: it is data about data. I don't like this definition. As I said, I'm very practically oriented. When I teach actually a very similar slide deck to this to emerging librarians and information professionals, there's always sort of the divide between the philosophers who are like, this is great, and the people who are like, this is just a circle. So again, I like to take a more practical, functional look at metadata. And this is a great definition from Riley's Understanding Metadata, a NISO presentation linked below. It'll be linked in the slides. And Riley defines metadata as this: metadata, the information we create, store, and share to describe things, allows us to interact with these things to obtain the knowledge we need. So let's break this down a little. So metadata is information, it's data, that we create in order to store, and that we create, we store, and share, and we're doing it to describe things. So metadata is information that describes things. And why do we do this? Because it allows us to somehow better leverage those things, whatever it is we're describing, to get at the knowledge we need, to do something, to learn something, to share something. Another perspective from, again, a great text on metadata. It's freely available online. It's a little more humanities and sort of GLAM, galleries, libraries, archives, and museum focused, but the Getty's Intro to Metadata. And in a chapter in that publication is this other definition, which is perhaps a more useful big picture way of thinking about metadata. Is as the sum total of what one can say of aggregation. And again, I'm going to break that down because at first pass that sentence is a little crazy. So metadata is the sum total of what one can say. So metadata as a statement is something we can say about a thing. And you're going to say that at a moment. So metadata is temporal. So if I say right now, I live in Rochester, that's what's happening at this moment in time. 5 years ago, I would not have said, I live in Rochester. I would have said, I live in Maryland. Your current paper may be, however, 5 Okay, and now you've been working on it for a while, and now it's 30, because again, it's a moment in time, it's temporal. And then what is it at any level of aggregation? Well, are we talking about this single output, the single piece of data? Are we talking about a data set? Are we talking about a total corpus of work, a book chapter, a book, a library? So it's, again, metadata isn't like a singular monolith of this one thing is metadata. But what I hope we're going to get out of this is that metadata is it's statements, and it's statements for use. So this is how I like to define metadata. So someone was going to come up to me and say, what is metadata? I'd say metadata are structured statements about resources. And for resources, sub in whatever it is you're interested in your life. I tend to care about materials that libraries care about. You have other interests and needs. Why do we make structured statements? So these statements allow us to do things, discover, access, use, preserve, and share whatever stuff you have. And something I also want to call attention to when we talk about metadata is that one person's data may be another person's metadata, or vice versa. Again, there's no one singular monolithic way of saying this one thing is metadata, because ultimately metadata comes down to use. It has to be suitable for whatever purpose you want. And sometimes it may be, what your metadata is may not be useful to someone else. So let's take a look at an example and break this down. So we have here on the left, we have a picture from my phone, and then on the right, we have the metadata, the information about this image. And I just used a freely available app on my phone to pull this information up. So there's a couple things I want to kind of draw your attention to. So metadata is describing, these are things we can say about this image. It has a name, it has a size, it has the date and time it was created. This information, this metadata, is very audience dependent. So, I may care that I took this picture back in 2017, but someone who is more interested in the photographic nature of it is going to care about what the exposure time was, or someone who is interested in, GIS data is going to care where this photo was taken. And I hope you notice too that, I said metadata is structured statements about resources, that there's a structure here. So we have everything on the right side, which should be, left side, real good at this, is these sort of labels. It's name, size, dimension. We're pretty used to sort of seeing, information on the left, a category on the left, if you will, and then a value on the right. So we have a name is img_65599.jpg. Exposure mode on one side, auto exposure on the other. And we're very used to this. You probably were already digging into this and relying on the structure before, I even drew your attention to it, because it's just, how we are used to engaging in this kind of information. It's, again, things you are using metadata every day in order to understand, gain access to, engage with, use resources. So I have a screenshot here from NYU's online data repository. And again, we have these bolded categories or elements or whatever you want to call them, and then information, the values underneath. Same thing with the canal system from the New York State data.newyork.gov. You see that kind of chart structure again. You see these sort of, bold information and then information underneath. But I also want to draw your attention to with the data, the New York State one, there's an updated by. Remember, again, metadata, these statements about our stuff, they're time bound, they're temporal, they're a snapshot, they're a moment in time. So it's saying this data set as of this moment as we've defined it, this is what you need to know. And again, but you have different elements of time. You have date created as well. So it kind of gives you a sense using that metadata of, again, the time-bound nature, the longevity of the resource. So now that we know what sort of metadata is, metadata as statements about resources, why do we care? We care because we can do things with metadata as incredible function and purpose. So as I said earlier, metadata allows us to discover, access, use, preserve, and share information and knowledge, whatever it is that you care about in your life or your work. We rely on metadata, often without being aware of it, to navigate, understand the world in our work, just with the examples from the previous slides, and as well as, relying on that metadata. We're relying on familiar or standardized structure inherent in the metadata, inherent in those statements, as much as we do the data or the information itself. And so let's dig into a little bit what I mean by that. So I have here 3 citations, each in a different citation style for an information resource, for a thing we care about. In this case, it's I think, really incredible biography on LEL, who was an early 19th century poet. And many of you, I mean, we're here in academia, you probably looked at that and went, oh, citations. But you're able to, depending on the domain, the field you're in, maybe you're an APA person, maybe you're Chicago, maybe you're MLA, you can parse, you can gain the information you need because you understand the inherent structure in the statement. You know where to look for the date, and you also understand that 2019 is a date. You understand that first ed is first edition, that a place is place of publication. So again, we're relying on these metadata structures, these agreed upon structures, to help us engage with and navigate the world, and to do the work we need to do. So let's talk a little bit more about statements, how we construct them, why we construct them, what they do. So I find it useful at this point to kind of talk about the types of metadata. So what are the different types of statements we can make about our resources or our things? And I just want to say straight off, these are not the only categories. These categories aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. This is my approach. You may see other resources describing it differently, but this is how I feel it's sort of useful to frame it. And for me, there's sort of 3 big categories. There's descriptive, administrative, and structural. So what is descriptive metadata? I think this is what we tend to think about when we think about metadata, when we think about the statements we make to describe our stuff. Something has, as we saw with the photo, it has a date, a time, a geographic location. A video may have a duration. Things have file names, file type, a creator. You could look at the PowerPoint or the PDF you're going to get later and see who made it on what date. If we're talking about people, again, metadata doesn't just exist in the digital world. It exists. You can talk about whatever it is that we want. You have a name, an address, a high school, a GPA. Data may be, or whatever your resources may have come from a piece of equipment, may be related to a particular method or approach, or may also be interrelated with other data or other resources. So relationships between stuff. Then there's something I like to think of as administrative metadata. This is more of the back end stuff. This helps you manage and administer your information. So for example, in the library world, I think about the stuff we create and put out to you all so you can leverage our collections and resources. That's descriptive metadata. The stuff we need to use to steward and manage our collections. How much did something cost? When was it bought? How, was this ever used, or how often it was used? That's administrative metadata to me. And there's 3, again, roughly speaking, sort of types of this metadata. There's technical metadata, and that's probably something you're all very familiar with. It accounts for the information about the file or the resource itself. This is a PDF. It is this big. It was created on this date. There's rights metadata, which helps you understand the intellectual property status or access options for a resource. This has a Creative Commons license, so I can do whatever I want with it. This is highly restricted to only a certain set of people with a certain use. This is embargoed and no one can touch it for the next 80 or 90 years. And then finally, there's preservation metadata, which aids in the management of resources over a period of time. And you should consider that is something you may be interested in as well. You probably have things you care about that you're going to want to last more than a week or 2. And think about what is it that you need to know about your stuff to maintain it. Maybe it was the last time a file was updated, or where something lives, where is the file path, things like that. And finally, there's structural metadata, and that helps you define relationships between parts. And this is, I think, metadata that's very useful, but we don't often think about it or think about creating it. So that may help you define or connect between portions of a data set. It's going to be the metadata, the statements that define chapters or section within chapters. I'm sure you've all played around in Word, where you can, create sections in Word, and then it creates the table of contents for you. That's relying on structural metadata. Or defining levels of a hierarchy, and then that trickle down relationship, if someone has whatever you could say about this uppermost thing, that information trickles further down the hierarchy. But in order to do that, you have to understand those hierarchical relationships. So how do we do this? So we know metadata statements about resources. We're talking about the different types of statements we can make. But now, how do we do this? So we're going to take a moment, and I want you to consider your stuff, whatever it is that you are most interested in right now. And I'm going to take a sip of water while you do that. So whenever anyone comes to me and they say they have, a metadata question, they're trying to create metadata for something, this is, really sort of the cheat list of questions that I walk them through. So the first thing to consider is, what is it that you have? Is it data? Is it a collection of books? Is it information about people? Is it email addresses, something? What is it that you have? What is your stuff? What do you want to do with it? If you don't necessarily care about, say, sharing your information with anyone else, do you care about rights, as one example? What can you say about it? So if I am looking at this laptop in front of me, I can say, just by looking at it, what color it is, who made it, how big the screen is, things like that. What can't you say about it? And this is often sometimes an aha moment for people, because you may want to be able to look right at say a piece of data and know right off the bat what research method was used to create it. You may want to just download a PDF of an article and know exactly how many times it's been cited and by who. But if you have to be able to have that information before you can make that statement. Who's your intended audience? Is this metadata that you're creating just for yourself? Or is this metadata that you're going to be sharing with colleagues, with the wider world? Just as you think about how you communicate. I mean, again, if we're thinking about metadata as statements, it's a form of communication. Just as how I may be describing metadata to you all is not necessarily the approach I'm going to take if I'm describing it to future librarians. This is not the way I described it to the Data Governance Council, to be perfectly frank. So thinking about your audience is going to help you just consider how you're going to make those statements. And finally, who else may be using or leveraging that information? So it's not just who's necessarily using the thing, what they're going to want to know about your stuff, but who else may also be leveraging that metadata, who may be trying to take all these wonderful statements you made and try to use them in their own context. I just want to emphasize again, do not forget your audience when you're creating metadata. An example on the left is something I deal with a lot, even though I tell my students, if you're going to hand this in, here's the file name I want. So when I download 30 of these, this is what I get, a variety of assignment one, which makes sense to you in the confines and context of your desktop. But when it comes to my laptop, it's chaos. Some on the right are questions, that you may need to want to, or questions that you're going to want to answer with your metadata. This one's real. I need a book on Matthew Vassar. The cover is red. The late great Betty Daniels walked into archives and special collections, and she would drop bombs like this, and that's all she had. That's all. Those are the only statements she could make. That's the only metadata she had. But she still wanted to get to the thing she needed. I need a snapshot of all of relevant data between now and last month. Okay, well, you know now and last month, but what's relevant in this context? How many papers did my lab publish between this date? Okay, you got a date time, you've limited to your lab. What do you mean by papers? And also maybe, what do you mean by lab? One thing I want to hit home is that you can only leverage the metadata that you have or that you can understand. So if you, again, this is a metadata is labor, but it's a labor of love. And if you take the time to maybe a little bit longer to add additional statements, create additional metadata, because you can do it in the moment, that's going to help you off further on down the line. So I want to get back, though, to this notion of structure. So let's remember that metadata are structured statements about resources. Again, just like sentences, I'm speaking English right now, there's an inherent structure to the way I'm speaking. And again, we rely on the familiar or standardized structure inherent in the metadata as much as we do on the data itself, as we saw earlier on. So I want you to look at this date. What date is this? If you were going to turn this into words, is this June 8th, 2010? Is this August 6th, 2010? Is this the 10th of August, 2006? Is this the 8th of October, etc.? So when we think about structure, we also need to think about structure in context. How I would interpret this in America is perhaps not how someone in continental Europe would interpret that structure. So thinking too, again, that structure is not necessarily universal, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. And I just put this slide in here again, because I just like to emphasize that you can only leverage the metadata that you have. And again, the metadata that you can understand, that you understand how that data is formatted so you can do something with it, so your computer can process it. So how do we create these structured statements? We're now going to talk about metadata schema. So what is metadata schema? And again, this is maybe something that you all have heard about. Maybe you've been told that you need to use a particular schema in your research, something like that. So what a schema is, it's a set of metadata definitions focused on the resources you're describing and or a community of practice. So sometimes, for example, to use a library example, we tend to have schemas or definitions based on media, on DVDs and video games, or again, a community of practice. This is how libraries are going to describe a DVD. That may not be how someone in film preservation would describe a DVD. Difference in community of practice, different statements. What do schema do? Well, schema, it creates a common vocabulary and semantics that allows for shared understanding of your metadata and of your structure. And by that, it means if I say this is a date, you understand what I mean by date. It's the date of publication, or is it my birth date? And its structure. You can look at that piece of data and you know where that month is, where that date is, where that year is. Again, it creates a mutual common understanding about your metadata and the statements you're making. This is from Hodge's Understanding Metadata. And I just wanted to hit on this definition quickly, because I like that it describes that, metadata schemas are for a specific purpose. You're trying to do something. And so these elements that you create, these things that you're defining in your schema, that's the semantics. That's the thing I want to say. And then it's going to also help me create values. So content. So let me show you what I mean by this. So we have here a resource on the left. We have a thing, a thing that I want to describe. So I want to say that my resource has a title. The statement I am making is that this has a title. That's the semantics, that's the element. Resource has title. But what's the value of that statement? In this particular instance, that value is Pickwick Papers. For another resource, you could say that title is Fast and Furious. You could say that title is Sonata in B minor, etc. But I hope what you can see here is that there's an established, this, for those of you who have ever done any like language outlining or something, you can kind of see that subject, object, predicate in there. For anyone who has played around with RDF resource description framework. It's that 3-part, that triple. You have a thing, you have what it is you can say or want to say about the thing, and then you have the value of that statement, the actual thing, the content of that statement. So to relate this back to what we've been talking about, so metadata schemas, and we're going to talk about one such called Dublin Core, it provides the properties that we can use to make our statements, what it is that we can say about it. We can say that a person has a name, a person has a social security number, a person has a birth date. What the schema won't tell you is what that value is. There's not going to be a metadata schema that's going to tell you my birth date, but it can tell you, where to find that information or how to express that value. So for example, it could give you a date format, a data format, how to, are you doing names, first name, last name, comma, first name. If you want to know my address, are you just going to type New York, or are you going to have a pick list where you click under state and you can select from a controlled list of values, a controlled vocabulary, to create the values for that statement. So this is a screenshot from the Dublin Core Metadata Initiative as an example of a schema. And you can see that, the term, the property is listed up there. We have date. It defines what we mean by date. So again, this is the mutual understanding. So the schema says, in this context, if you're going to use date, it's going to be a point or period of time associated with an event in the life cycle of the resource. So it's not just some random date. It's a date that specifically relates to this resource. And then it has some additional help where it says, hey, what would be great is if you used a particular data format for this. Same thing with title. So what is title? It's a name given to the resource. How do you define resource? How do you define name? That may be up to you, but again, it allows sort of a shared understanding there. And this one doesn't necessarily have a controlled vocabulary or things like that, kind of letting you know this is a little more free text, how you want to define it. So now that we've talked about, what metadata is, how do we structure it, how do we create it, I want to talk a little bit more about, how you're going to approach creating shareable metadata. And for me, this comes down to reduce, reuse, recycle. Reduce, do not reinvent the wheel or reinvent a standard. I talked a lot about, communities of practice have their own standards. People have been doing metadata work describing things for years. I'm very lazy. I like, good. I've always said for cataloging, good poets borrow, great poets steal. If someone else has done the work, reuse it yourself. We don't reinvent it. Borrow those statements, reuse, created by others, and then recycle. Allow others to borrow and use your statements. Very often we're describing very similar things, maybe sometimes even the exact same thing. So why not, help out the collective good by allowing others to reuse your metadata? So I said, don't recreate the wheel, don't reuse your own standards. So what do I mean by those standards? So why do we want to even use standards? So metadata created with standards, it's consistent, it's understandable, and it's shareable. If you are following these guidelines, for example, if you use a controlled vocabulary, if you use a list of countries, you're never going to have to worry about, did you mean Germany? Did you mean, Deutschland? We all have a shared understanding by using this limited list of values, what we mean by this country. Again, using data or encoding standards, how we format date. And then even more importantly, using a defined set of elements or a schema. So when I say creator, that I created this painting, we all understand what I mean by that because it's been defined in our documentation and our standard. If I say that this person contributed to this paper, what does that mean? We have a shared understanding of what it means when we say that. And if we all and if it's consistent, we can expect, every time I look at the date field, we know what we're going to see and we're going to use it. We can share it. Other people can borrow that and reuse it and sync it in with their own materials. So as I also called out, many communities of practice or disciplines have already established metadata scheme and control vocabularies that align with or best represent their resources, their audiences, and their tools. So again, you don't need to reinvent the wheel because likely someone has done this already for you. So in libraries, we're very good about creating, standards that are just for libraries, but some other places have, borrowed those as well. But other disciplines may also, if they don't want to create their own, they may rely on adaptations, which are sometimes known as extensions of existing schemas. So for example, we talked about this schema called Dublin Core, which was created honestly back in the 90s to describe elements on the web. It's really simple and straightforward. It's like 15 things you can say about an object. The ecology and bio communities took that and said, okay, this is a good basis. We're going to expand on it and create something called Darwin Core. Also, I mean, the name is just fabulous. So I shared a link from the UNC libraries here. Their metadata guide provides a lot of links to discipline-specific schemas. So if you're not quite sure where to start out, that may be what place to go. So if you're thinking about, again, which standards should you be using? You want to create metadata, you want to describe your stuff. Again, if you come to me and you ask me that question, I don't do the work you do. So these are probably the questions I'm going to walk you through. What are your colleagues and your peers using? Because likely you're going to want to be maybe borrowing their metadata, or maybe you want to be able to share your stuff with them, and they're going to want to be able to understand what it is you're sharing. So think about who it is that you are going to be working with, sharing your stuff with. What standards are inherent in your tools and workflows? Is there a built-in schema in your camera, as one example? Is there, in libraries, many of the systems, if we're going to use a tool called Omeka to put up some digital collections, that comes with Dublin Core built in. I may not pick something else on top of that because that's inherent in the tool. What standards align with your stuff? You're not going to necessarily want to use a standard, designed to describe books, to describe a data set, or a standard to describe audio files, to describe a print file, for example. So what standards really can help you make the statements that are relevant to the things you have? And finally, I mean, that just comes down to what standards can help you create statements that are useful and actionable, that can help you say things about your stuff in a way that allows you to better leverage and use your resources, your stuff, and share your stuff with other people. Regardless of what you do, you should document that, document it. So it's not just documenting your metadata, but documenting the decisions around how and why you create your metadata. Because I know how my memory is, how I approach, labeling a file today. That's not how I did it 5 years ago necessarily. And if I want to be able to find my stuff and use my stuff, I'm going to need to write a note for myself to remind me this is how I organized my W-2s this year. This may be a true story. Documentation also allows anyone interested in your metadata to understand how and why your metadata looks and works the way it does. Why do you only have a handful of values for this particular, if I'm talking about the genre? Oh, it's because I decided I wanted to use this vocabulary. I used this list. I decided because of how I organize things, I like last name, comma first instead of first name, comma last, things like that. And this kind of documentation is really important if you're going to diverge from a standard or if you've created a standard of your own. We do this a lot in libraries, and in my department, we have documentation. We try to always follow national and international standards because, again, it makes it very easy for us to go to other tools and other places and go, oh, you've described this thing. You've now saved me hours of work. Thank you very much. I'm going to reuse this. But sometimes, for very necessary reasons, we're going to want to do things a little differently in order to serve our users. We may want to say, add a local note because we care about calling out that the person who wrote this book is a faculty member at the University of Rochester. someone down at the University of Maryland doesn't care. They don't need that piece of information, but that's something that's specific and local to us. So we add that to our standards because we care about it. And it's, again, it's fine that we can do that, but I need to know years later when I'm, say, moving between systems, what is this piece of information here because it doesn't align with the national standard. This is a screenshot from a document tool. I call it a data dictionary. Data dictionaries don't always look the same depending on the context in which you're using it. But this is how I tend to think of and describe data dictionaries. So you can see I have here my element, the thing I want to say. I want to make a statement that this thing has a title. For mapping, if you were to click on that link, that would take you back to Dublin Core. And I'm uniquely saying, hey, everyone, when I say title, I mean this title for everyone. Is this required or optional? When I do my work, everything has to have a title. Everything may not need to have a date. These are decisions that I've made for me for X reasons. I'm not going to use a controlled vocabulary, but if I were, that's where I would point to controlled vocabulary. If I was, say, again, describing like physical objects, like someone's personal collection, I may use the art and architecture thesaurus by the Getty, because that's such a fun vocabulary. They literally may have like an entry for stationery or paper clips or political pins, like name a thing that exists, you can create a unique controlled term for that. How do I define title? Title is a name given to the resource. How do I, within my context, use a title? And this came from a historical photograph collection project I did 1,000 years ago. So for me, the title, it may be on a white sticker on the back of a photograph or written on the photocopy of the photo located in a 3-ring binder in the stacks by the collection. That is hella specific. But if someone was, say, to come up behind me, say after I left said institution, they could continue on creating this metadata. And after I've left, understood, well, where the hell did she get this title from? And then, because I'm a nice person, giving some examples of that, what you may expect to see when you create this metadata, this description of this thing. So we have plenty of time for questions. I just want to sort of conclude with, so metadata basically allows you to achieve your goals. It allows you to do what you want, what you need to do with your resources, to understand your resources, to share your resources. But again, you can only leverage the metadata that you have. So I'm going to stop sharing. Again, in these slides, there's my email address. If you have any questions, want to email me after this, I'm happy to help. We also, on the library website, I have a link here to our Metadata Outreach program, which has more information on how, we can help you solve your metadata problems and some resources so you can maybe take a first whack at that yourself. Does anyone have any questions, thoughts?
First, I would say a round of applause for Maggie. Thank you.
Thanks.
I'll start with a question, Maggie, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Oh, no, there's a real question. I have a real question too, but there's a question in the chat. I'll let you answer that.
All right. Do you have any guidelines for setting up a glossary of terms? Oh, I do. So the first thing, I'm assuming you mean like a glossary pick list. Like I want to uniquely say, if you're going to say something, you can only pick from X list. Is that kind of where you're at?
Right. Yeah. Everybody's not working with the same set of terms.
Yeah. So the first thing I would do, and if you came to me, would literally head to Google and start seeing if someone else has created a list like this. So I helped I think it was institutional research when they were spinning up Huron. We want to describe disciplines, like what are the different research areas. And we found a controlled vocabulary that they use in Australia and New Zealand that we could adapt because someone else has, had already gone and used that. If it may be simple as like, whatever thing it is, controlled vocabulary, glossary, vocabulary, something like that. But if there doesn't exist, and that's totally appropriate, For me, it's an iterative process. You build it as you go and you document. So you take first thing you have, say I'm looking at color. There's color vocab out there, but I'm going to say this is red and I'm defining it as red because X percentage of this pattern is red. And so I'm like, term 1 is red, usage note. I made the decision because it's the majority of the pattern. Item 2, blue, etc. Or, oh no, this one isn't orange. Is this maybe red? Maybe I need another term. And you kind of build and go from there. And again, as long as you have a place where that is documented and you're also sort of defining as you go, that's how I would suggest building it out. One thing I didn't hit on, I think at all, maybe in the presentation, is for me, metadata is an iterative process. Again, we talked about metadata as a snapshot in time. So you very often, like, again, if I had to go back and look at the first digital collection I did in 2010, I don't want to look at the choices, the decisions, the approach I made there, because I've learned a little bit more about the work, but also my perspective on the materials may have changed. What I need, what my community wants to use, how they want to engage with that collection may be completely different. So don't feel if you've created that term like you're locked into that for forever, because again, metadata should serve its purpose. So I hope that was a bit helpful.
That was wonderful. Thank you.
Welcome.
I'll ask my question, Maggie, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
So you touched a little bit on this in your presentation, but if someone were to come to you with a metadata question through the Metadata Outreach service, what would they expect? I know you touched on some of the questions you would ask, but could you outline like kind of how you would help someone through?
Yeah, I mean, usually the first thing I'm going to kind of ask you to do is to maybe give me a little more background on what it is you're trying to achieve. So, we talked about like, how would I set up a glossary of terms? If you actually came to me for metadata outreach, the first thing I'm going to do is, well, what are you trying to do? Are you trying to, it's a data entry problem because people keep going wild, or I eventually want to run an analysis on something and I want to be able to group questions like that, because we may decide, well, maybe you don't need a glossary. Maybe what you need is better guidelines. Maybe what you're trying to, the original thing you were trying to create a glossary for isn't actually the statement you care about. You don't actually care about color. What it is that you care about depth, something like that. So it is kind of a back and forth to try to figure out what it is that you're trying to accomplish. If it's something I can help with right there, we may kind of get to work. If it's something I need to maybe go do a little research on, I'll sort of know from that initial email if this is like, oh yeah, cool, let's do 20 minutes, or, oh, I'm going to need some time to work that out. And then it's kind of a dialogue and kind of a back and forth. I'm not here to make metadata for people. I have enough metadata to make on my own, but really it's helping you figure out the best way to, if you need to make metadata or clean up some existing metadata, what are the resources, tips, tricks, things like that. For me, metadata outreach is more of an empowerment kind of a process, so you can learn how to approach your metadata problems and solve them yourself.
That's great. Thank you, Maggie.
Tara, can I jump in a second not with a question?
Sure,
with
please.
A comment?
Of course.
Thank you. I just wanted to say thank you to Maggie. You helped me tremendously today to solve a problem that I've been putting off, a task really. And so it gave me such encouragement, because I was going to procrastinate further and say, I'll do it this summer. But now I just feel that I can tackle it now. And I absolutely am grateful for the reminder that we have to consider the audience, because the person I work most closely with on this metadata, we have this little dance that we do about, as long as she understands it, we're good. And then we end up doing double work when someone has a question that we could have had put out there in the metadata. So there's so much, and I'm guilty too. It's like an egocentric look at the metadata. As long as it works and makes meaning for me, then it's okay. But there's a universality to that. when it's going to be shared as a widely used resource. So thank you. I feel so much better.
Well, I'm so glad to hear that. And I mean, and it's not, I mean, that's a problem we all face. And I mean, we face with that, you know, in our own personal stuff, but even within libraries, you know, we've tried over the
Mhm.
years to ensure our standards and our approaches are for the user to help them out. And there's a quote by, I'm going to butcher it, by Charles M. E. Cutter, who was a cataloger back in the early 20th century, who essentially his perspective was, you put the convenience of the user before the cataloger. So if it's going to take more time and effort for
Yeah,
you,
that's great.
but it's better for the audience,
Mhm.
that's where you focus your work. And also thinking about, and I wish is something we did a little more in libraries, and I know we have some new positions coming on, we're going to be doing more of it, is, you know, I think sometimes we think we know what our users want, we think we know what our audience wants, but if you actually engage more and be like, here's a series of statements, does that make sense? You know, or they're going to come back and be like, what? I thought this was going to tell me X, but it didn't. And you're like, oh, because it means Y. So again, metadata as it's statements, it's communication. So if you think of metadata as like you know, you almost need like a communication plan in a way around it. But yeah, the more engagement you can have on that, I think the better. But again,
That's
I'm
great.
so glad you have that momentum and have figured it out, but also just realize that there are a generation of people who have been right where you are, who are just like, oh God, I don't want to do this. Like, there's a cart sitting in my office right
True.
now. There's a reason I'm not in there. You're not looking at it. We all go through
Yeah.
it.
Mhm. Thank you.
Welcome.
All right. Well, if we could give Maggie another round of Zoom applause. That was a very short round, but a big round.
Phil.
I see all the rounds. I see celebrations. Thank you, Maggie. This was a wonderful presentation. And I can tell it really, really helped me. I learned something new every time I hear you talk about metadata. And we appreciate your time.